about fears. Let's talk about love. Yeah, I got fears, but I ain't got no love.
So today I want to talk about a case that I stumbled across. Um, it was on a documentary that really intrigued me, and normally I don't watch true crime documentaries anymore, but I did this one. It made me think. I watched one the other night, if you want to call it true crime. It's more mystery, but it was Finding Amelia Earhart on HBO or Cinemax or something. And it was so predictable. I guess now that I've done a TV show, I knew what to expect, and the big reveal before a commercial, and then it turns out to be not. I mean, it was just sickening, really. I mean, I don't even know why I watched it, but I digress. This one was very interesting, and it was about Jacob Wetterling. And Jacob was an 11-year-old boy from St. Joseph, Minnesota, and he was abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered on October 22nd, 1989. Uh, I want to talk about this case because there's good aspects to it and there's bad aspects to it. And we can learn as investigators about what was good, what was done well, and what was horribly done wrong. So let's start off with the night of October 22nd, 1989. Jacob, 11-year-old, is riding bicycle with his younger brother who is 10 and a friend who is 12, and it's at night. Apparently, it's their first night excursion, and they ride bikes into town to rent a movie. They're very careful about this, meaning the boy up front has a flashlight. The boy in the middle was wearing white, and the Jacob, who was in the rear, was wearing a reflective vest. So they took precautions, and they rode. And it's not like it's a suburban area; it's very rural. They make it there. They rent their movie, and on their way back, um, a gentleman with a gun forces them off the road. He is in there's a driveway there, like a country driveway that goes back to a farm owned by, I believe the last name, if I'm pronouncing it right, is Rasier. Now, what is interesting about this case to me, and these are cases that I love to analyze because you have witnesses. Okay, one boy is murdered, which is a tragedy. But let's try to turn that tragedy into something that we can learn from. Two other boys were not harmed. They were harmed mentally. No doubt about it, for the rest of their lives. But thank goodness that physically they weren't harmed. So what happened is the man had a mask on, like a nylon stocking type of deal, and he forces these three boys that are on bike off of the road. He tells them to get in a ditch or he will shoot them. They lie down in the ditch. They offer him, they believe that they're getting robbed. They offer him the movie, and the offender knocks the video out of the boy's hand. He rolls the boys over and looks at them. He makes a conscious effort to physically look at their faces. He tells Jacob's younger brother and the other boy that was with them, they ask them their age, and they tell them 10, 11, 12. He tells the 12-year-old and the youngest one that's 10, stand up and run. Don't look back or I will shoot you. So the boys run. That leaves Jacob there. The boys run to the house where they had left from, Jacob's house, alerted a neighbor because the parents weren't home. What happened? Search is on. And Jacob is never found. Okay. Now, a few months earlier, this happened in October. I want to say that in February timeframe, about 30 miles away, there was another sexual assault that took place of a young boy. That was unsolved. But they were able to get some evidence from that. Boy wasn't murdered, but we don't know that Jacob's murdered, but he's missing. An individual named Danny Heinrich becomes a suspect pretty early on that year, 1989. At the crime scene where police alleged that, well, not alleged, where it did take place, the abduction, they found footprints and they found tire impressions. These matched the vehicle of Danny Heinrich, and also the footprints matched treadwear that he had. Now, to be fair, a lot of people don't know that. They'll report that they matched Danny Heinrich. But it's important to note that sometimes when you get reports back from experts, they will say things like, the tire impression found at the crime scene is consistent, could be, possibly a match to the tires found on Danny Heinrich's vehicle. You can't make an arrest off of that, okay? But as an investigator, if I look into the background of Danny Heinrich and I find out, okay, he's been arrested before, and I'm not sure if he has, but if he has proclivities to younger boys, if his shoe does match, if we can put him in the area and the tire impression matches, it's a totality of everything. We can't discard him. You can't arrest him. Certainly you bring him in, you talk to him, and they did. He took a polygraph and he failed the polygraph. Now, that means nothing alone, especially to me, because I don't believe in polygraphs. Yet, again, the totality of everything. He's brought in, he's interviewed, he doesn't confess to anything, but he failed a polygraph. The boy that was abducted in February is shown a lineup, and he cannot pick Danny Heinrich out. He can only deduce that it's either him or another person. You can't arrest on that. But what can you do? You can keep him in the back of your mind, or I wouldn't. I would keep him in the forefront of my mind. Okay, each individual thing does not point towards guilt. Yet, the totality of all the evidence, meaning the footprints, we can't rule them out. They could match. The tire impressions, they can't be ruled out. They match, possibly, probably, whatever the verbiage was. He failed the polygraph. I don't believe in polygraphs, but yet I'm going to keep that as a little piece of evidence for me. His background. Oh, and we're going to ask him about Jacob Wetterling, and now he lawyers up. Okay. at that point in time, listen, everybody has the right to lawyer up, okay? Especially if you've done something wrong in the past and you don't want it uncovered. But it's everything. My focus is on Danny. Period. End of story. Yet, for some reason, the police let it drift. They let it go away. He was arrested in 1989. Not for Jacob Wetterling, but for the abduction of and assault of the other little boy. For one night, and then they let him go with a handshake. Now, what does that mean? Well, listen, to be honest with you, I've done that before. I've arrested a murder suspect on something else, an unrelated charge that was weak. He did it, okay, but it was weak, and it wasn't why I was arresting him. I was arresting him for two things. One, to get him in jail, to get him to make phone calls so I can listen. Secondly, because I want him to break, okay? I want him to talk to somebody. I'm going to go back in and talk to him. He's in jail now. He's been stripped of his liberty. And not for no reason. He committed a crime. So I understand that maybe that's the reason that they did that. But the next day they let him go. And the official reasoning for that is that the attorney dropped charges. Well, listen, the attorney had to approve charges. The district attorney had to approve charges to get an arrest warrant to lock him up. And for them to, he have a change of heart overnight, the next day release him? No, it's a ploy. It's a tactic. It didn't work. So, he's out. We fast forward now to about 2009. The country driveway where this assault and abduction occurred, as I said, belonged to the farm of the Rassiers. And the individual that was home at the time was the Rassier's son, Dan. And Dan is a music teacher at a school. He's home alone, not sure where his parents were at the time. And he calls 911. He observes a car turning around in his driveway twice. Now, you got to remember, it's a long driveway. But he sees the headlights come in, the car turn around. And he doesn't really think anything of it. But then later on at night, he says that he sees like a flashlight by his wood pile. And he thought that somebody was there stealing wood. So Dan, because of the location of the abduction and because of what he sees, in 2009, some brilliant police detectives, and I'm using brilliant very sarcastically, decide to make him, Dan, the suspect. Now, I listened to audio recordings of the interview that they had with Dan. Probably one of the worst interviews I've ever seen conducted. Meaning, not as a tactic like, read interrogation or anything like that. It's that they accused him. Listen, we know you did it. Okay? It only makes sense that you did it. And he's defending himself, but he's not being unprofessional like a lot of people would be, and probably he had every right to be. You're innocent, and they're accusing you. That is Obviously wrong. But what comes next? I've talked about, and I'm going to give you different examples. In their infinite wisdom, these police detectives, if you want to call them that, decide to make him go to the press and label him a person of interest. I've talked about this in the Idaho murders. I've talked about this in the Brittany Drexel case. You cannot go to the press or even social media now and say, we have a person of interest, when you have no evidence linking this person to the crime. Because as we will find out, Dan Rassier had nothing to do with this murder. Yet his name, and he was a school teacher, is soiled and ruined by a couple of untrained, over-aggressive detectives and supervisors, whoever they are, because they're the ones that had to have called a press conference and labeled Dan as a person of interest. Why? Because you can't figure it out. Ruining a person's reputation who is completely innocent is the most egregious thing one can do in true crime. It happens all the time now because of amateur detectives who have carte blanche to the internet and can post whatever they want. A perfect example of that is the Ketty murders, where these idiots want to say that Sheila Sharp was involved in the murder of her family, and they put it out there for others to I think to use the internet, you need a license, especially in true crime. It's sickening. Unless you know, unless you have proof, unless you are 100% sure. And by 100% sure, I mean you better have direct physical evidence linking your suspect to that crime. If not, keep their name out of your mouth, because you ruin not only their reputation and their life, you do it for their family and their family. And it's uncalled for. And it infuriates me beyond belief. But you have people that don't care. It's all about their glory. Making an arrest. Making it look like that I did something. Prosecutors are known for that. Police detectives are as well, and chiefs and captains. It's not the way police work should be done. It's not the way investigations should be done. So, Dan Rassier, and I've reached out to Dan, and I personally apologize to him. He has ended up suing the police department, and I don't blame him. I would too. But I reached out to Dan and I offered my apologies on behalf of law enforcement for the way he was treated, and his name and his family's name was dragged through the mud. He can't even go to the grocery store without people pointing a finger at him, even though he has nothing to do with this. He accepted my apology and thanked me, and I'll move on, and as I'm sure he will. But I wanted him to know, hey, there are people in law enforcement that care, people that are detectives, investigators that care, and I want you to know that what they did to you was wrong. So that was 2009. They even got a search warrant to search his property. Dug in his field. Of course, they found nothing because there's nothing there. Yet this is the same police department who the morning after the abduction had the ditch roped off where the tire impressions and the footprints of the real offender were, Dan has to go to work as a school teacher. He hadn't missed a day in 20 years. Guess what the police officers allowed him to do? Drive through that ditch, around the tape to get to school. Not a joke. Anyway, that's 2009. Somewhere around 2016, some smart investigators, and I wish I knew who they were, and because I'm not using this sarcastically, actually honed in on the real offender, which was Danny Heinrich, the person of interest all the way back in 1989. They go and talk to him. I listened to that interview as well. They did a search warrant at his house. They found children's clothing, although he had no children. They found hundreds and thousands of child pornography, home videos of him going to playgrounds, zooming in on little boys' butts, their crotches, and if they would have done that in hindsight's 2020, I get it. But if you have enough for a search warrant in 2009 to dig up a field in an innocent person's farm, you're telling me you didn't have enough probable cause to do a search warrant in 1989? At the true offender's residence? You would have found all that stuff then. Danny Heinrich is arrested, but he's not arrested for Jacob Wetterling's murder. He's not even arrested for the January-February sexual assault of the boy previous to Jacob in 1989. Statutes of limitations have run out on that, and I don't understand that, but every state's different. He's arrested for the child pornography that he has. Now, this is where leverage comes in. This is the good part about this investigation. They're able to leverage that, and they take that child pornography federal. Listen, I worked for the FBI. I've worked under two different sets of laws. The state law, Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth, and the federal law. And I love the federal law a lot more. It's a lot more powerful. The sentencings, the guidelines, much more powerful. The burden of proof is a little bit lower. I loved working for the FBI and doing a search warrant and doing an arrest and doing a consensual intercept of phone calls, because you didn't have all the paperwork and the probable, you had probable cause, but I mean, it's just a different level. Here they're able to take him federally and charge him federally for the child pornography. That's a good thing, because that enhances his penalties, gives him more years. And what they were able to do is leverage that. Now these smart detectives, whoever they are, kudos to you if you're watching this. You can go to him, which they did. Hey, we know you're involved. Now listen, there's a difference now between accusing Danny Heinrich, who did it, because you have direct physical evidence. You have his footprint. You have the tire impressions. You have all the child pornography. You have the children's clothes. You have a sketch that matches him. You have a car that matches what was seen by the boys. All these things. It's the totality. What do you have for Dan Rassi? You had nothing. The only thing that you had for him was he was home alone. The abduction occurred at his driveway at the bottom of it. And I I take that back. Those 3 boys did not see a car. The other abduction in January or February of the boy, the sexual assault, he saw a car. He was actually put in the car. So because those 3 boys didn't see a car, in 2009, they're like, oh, well, maybe it was Dan Rassier. He just walked down and abducted him. Hey, I have nothing wrong with that theory. Okay? But you had tire impressions down there. And if those tire impressions didn't match any of the family's vehicle, it's a long country road, what's the chances that it's just a random tire impression in their driveway? You can accuse. Police can lie. Detectives can lie. We have DNA evidence linking you to the crime when you have nothing. I get that. I've done that. So, but I've done that to somebody that I know is guilty because I have other physical evidence or corroborating evidence, whatever it is. Here, you're interviewing Danny Heinrich, the real offender. And you say, hey, we know you did it because of X, Y, and Z. The child pornography, the zooming in on the little boys, the boys' clothing, you match the description, your car matches the first set of abduction, which you were guilty of too. All of it matches. Now I can accuse you. And I can say to you, as leverage, tell me where Jacob Wetterling's remains are for his family who worked diligently for their boy to try to get justice. Even so far as the mom wearing a consensual wire from these detectives in 2009 to try to set up and get a confession from Dan Rassier, who on that recording called the police and the FBI idiots. And he believes that's why they retaliated against him. Probably, maybe, I don't know, but he's speaking the truth. They were idiots. Now, doing a consensual like that, I'm not going to say that they're wrong for that. He shouldn't even be a suspect. And if he is, you should never publicly announce it. I have no problem in wiring up the mom and having her talk to him. I got no problem with that. I get so frustrated at that I lost my train of thought. Where I was at or where I was going. But I know I was talking about Danny Heinrich and getting leveraged. You tell us where Jacob's remains are, we won't charge you with his murder. Sounds horrible, right? Yet. Let's say the man's 60 years old. He gets 25 years on the child pornography. Yeah, it's not the jaw-dropping death sentence or life sentence, but he's not going to get out of prison alive. So you weigh that. And you go to the family and see what they want. And they did the right thing. Yes, we'll do that. So guess what Danny Heinrich did? He confessed in 2016 of the murder of Jacob Wetterling. He was a suspect back in 1989. Now, does it matter that police didn't arrest him in 1989 when they probably had at least enough evidence for a search warrant? Maybe not an arrest, but they had probable cause for a search warrant. Well, maybe. There was plenty of victims in that child pornography stash that he had. Did he stop? He says he did in jailhouse calls that I listened to from him to his brother. He said that he stopped being that way, harming any boys after he killed Jacob. But what I want to do is I want to first talk about the confession. Because for me, it's all about learning. I've looked at so many unsolved cases in my 20 years doing this that when you get one that's solved, you try to learn from it. I do. Okay, if I looked at this case and I didn't know what happened, what the outcome was, how would I interpret it? What would my assessment be? And does it match what actually happened? In this case, we had the witnesses, the two boys that are with Jacob. But after he tells them to run, or he'll shoot them, now we don't know what happened. And it's in our job as investigators to try to interpret that. And I do it all the time. Okay. Now how did he control him now? Well, we know he has a weapon. Which way would he have driven? Would he have taken him home? We don't know any of that. It's all speculation based on statistics and training and experience. In this case, we have a confession from Danny who says, I handcuffed him behind his back, put him in the front seat, and this is the most chilling part for me. It's even more chilling than the killing. I don't know why. It just strikes me different. Little 11-year-old Jacob says to him, what did I do wrong? Man, that gets me. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I feel that he thinks that it's the police, that he's being handcuffed or being punished. But for some reason, him saying that gets me. Danny Heinrich drives him to a secluded location. Where he says he purposefully drives off of the road to the closest set of trees that there are. He gets Jacob out, unhandcuffs him, tells him to strip. This is October 22nd in Minnesota. It's cold out. Tells him to strip. I'm not going to get into detail. If you want, you just Google Danny Heinrich's confession. He sexually assaults the boy. Jacob asks if he could get dressed because he was cold. As a parent, I'm not even his parent. I can't imagine his own parents listening to that confession. Danny Heinrich states that he saw police activity going by. He heard sirens or something, and he got spooked. He got nervous. He told Jacob, walk in front of me. I got to go to the bathroom. He's a coward. He doesn't want to face the boy. And he pulls the trigger to the back of Danny's head, and it doesn't go off. It clicked an empty chamber because it was a revolver. He then shot. He looked. Jacob was still standing, and he shot him again. So he shot Jacob twice in the back of the head. He leaves him there. He goes home. And this is the areas that we can learn from. About an hour later, or several hours later, he decides to go back, specifically to bury the body. And why? I mean, that's important. To get rid of the evidence. So he goes back and he says he drags him 100 yards. That's a long way to drag somebody. But he was a fairly stocky guy, and, it's an 11-year-old kid, so I guess it's not too outrageous. The shovel he has with him, apparently, he realizes it's not going to work. It's an E-tool, E-trench type of thing. He was in the National Guard, apparently. Go figure. I don't mean that as a slight to people in the National Guard. I just mean it as, again, another bad person infiltrates um, a good public office. I was just thinking of our government, but I digress. He realizes that next door there's a bobcat, backhoe. He steals it and comes over and he buries him. At some point in time, and that's it. That's the confession. But at some point in time, he goes back to the crime scene years later, which is very important that you can learn from. He says when he goes there, he notices Jacob's red jacket is sticking up out of the ground. So he says he brings a bag and he unearths Jacob's remains, his clothing, puts it in the bag, and he takes it to another location and buries it. Now, this is very important to me because I feel that in one of my cases where the body was not recovered, Dawn Miller, that her offender, one of them, Greg Emmel, did the exact same thing. So it's important to know that it certainly does happen, and here's a first-hand account of it. He reburies Jacob's body in a pasture where he allegedly was sexually assaulted when he was a kid. Now, there could be some sort of significance to that, maybe even subconsciously, or maybe it's just a coincidence. But he leads investigators to his, I believe on September 1st, maybe September 3rd, 2016, and 30 miles from where the abduction occurred, 27 years earlier, he leads law enforcement to the remains of Jacob Wetterling, which he had reburied. I feel, a sense of resolution, that his remains were found. But first of all, I want to talk about the educational aspects of this and what we can learn, what we can deduce from it to help other cases going forward, because that's what it's all about. I learned a lot from this case, and that's why I wanted to discuss it. Things that were good, the things that were bad, But the sad reality of this is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Danny Heinrichs out there who have not been caught. He was a serial sexual offender. I've seen worse, okay? But I think it's important to know that Jacob, his murder, I would say, surprises me. And by that, let's say Jacob's body was, let's say everything was totally different. Danny Heinrich shoots the kid and his body is found the next day. If I was on scene, I got to be honest to say that the gunshot, it would have surprised me. Now, what would lessen the surprise is that I know that he was abducted by force of gun. But in my experience, sexual predators will sometimes use a weapon to gain compliance, but that doesn't mean that they are going to use that as their implement of death. Meaning, most of the time that I see, they would abduct with a knife, or in this case, a gun, but they would strangle or use a knife. And I guess it depends on the level of the sexual offender, the amount of gratification he is getting from it. Now, listen, Danny Heinrich and other sexual offenders, just because they're a sexual offender doesn't mean they're a serial killer, and it doesn't mean that they take gratification in the sexual they take gratification in the sexual act. They don't take gratification in the killing, such as Gary Ridgway, for example, the Green River Killer, where your murder, that act is what gets them off. That's the orgasmic result. Because there's some offenders who are impotent. They can't even get an erection. But killing gives them that satisfaction. That's not Danny Heinrich. Okay? So, although initially I think I would have been surprised that, it's a gunshot. It tells you, this is my point, it tells you what type of offender you're looking for. Now, not 100%, but it gives you a good idea. We are not looking at a serial killer sexual gratification person, meaning that the killing is what gets me off. We're looking at a serial sexual offender whose the acts of sex, the gratification of that with little boys is what gets him off. And that's where we should be focusing. I hope that makes sense to you. I don't think Danny Heinrich was 100% honest, in my opinion, on the reason he shot Jacob. He says because he heard sirens or police presence going down the road. They're going down the road. They're not stopping where you're at. And he says he heard sirens. That's not a common practice, at least when I was on the job. You're going to a missing person, an abduction. You're on a rural road. You're not in the city. There's no reasons for lights and sirens. Now, everybody in every department's different. I believe that he minimized. And offenders will do that often, especially in sexual cases. I'm not attracted to little boys, I'm into pornography, but just not little boys. And then you come out and you show them, you have a million pictures here of little boys. Oh, well, sometimes I come across that on the internet and I'll download it, but, I don't go to playgrounds or anything like that. I'm not that perverted. And then you confront them with that evidence, see how they minimize. They want you to think, okay, once you caught him in a lie or a plea deal like he had, okay, I'll tell you this, but I don't want you to think that I'm so depraved, I don't want you to think I'm so depraved that I just killed a boy, without remorse. Well, that's exactly what he did. I believe that he killed Jacob because of the first offender that he let go, and it was putting pressure on him that they had a sketch. They knew his car. It's a matter of time. He thought that he would get caught, and he did 27 years later, but he wasn't going to leave another witness that could identify him. He was in his car. He was going to kill him. I believe that, listen, it was premeditated. Certainly. The abduction was premeditated. Okay? He brings handcuffs. It's premeditated. But the killing is also premeditated. And remember, premeditation doesn't have to be a week in advance, a day in advance. Premeditation could be minutes in advance. He knew that after he was done sexually assaulting this boy, that he was going to kill him. He wasn't going to leave a witness. He said Jacob began to cry when Danny said, I can't take you home. That's because he was going to kill him. Had nothing to do with the police going by. That's asinine. Again, I want to reiterate, as much as it pains me to, there are idiot detectives out there and police officers. Hey, there's nothing we can do about it. There's idiot electricians and veterinarians and doctors and football players, believe it or not. It just happens. But you have to try to learn from it. I guess the best course of action is for me to talk to supervisors who are in charge of some of these idiots. Listen, you can't just let them run amok. You're okay and everything. You have to realize we can't hold a press conference to say a person's of interest in our investigation in the murder of an 11-year-old boy. Again, Brittany Drexel's case, the FBI come out and say, hey, we have information that, I can't even remember his name, Tim Taylor or something, was the murderer. You're going off of information you got from a drug informant. Now listen, I've used drug informants my whole career. Am I going to believe every single thing that they say? No. If they tell me that they witnessed a murder and it doesn't make sense because they fed her to alligators, does that make sense? No. And you have no corroborating evidence of such, but you're going to hold a press conference because you want some sort of fame and infamy that you closed this case? You're a joke. Just like the FBI agent who came out during the Idaho murders and said, well, I think the one victim's dad should be looked at very carefully. You're an idiot, buddy. You shouldn't be investigation. You shouldn't have the title FBI. And that's something else that people have to realize. Just because you have a title behind your name doesn't mean you're important or you know what the hell you're talking about. Case breakers, an example. All these FBI people that they supposedly have on their roster, and they all signed off on saying that Gary Francis Post was the Zodiac killer. Again, the FBI hires, they're not all correct. You can't believe them just because they're in the FBI. Why do you think you go for second opinions for doctors? The first person might not be right. And why do you think the second opinion you get is different than the first opinion? So just because they have an MD after their name doesn't mean that you have to believe what they're saying. Anyway, that's my rant for today. Again, we can learn a lot from Jacob Wetterling. I am so torn about reading that confession that Danny Heinrich said. I just crushed at what that little boy and his family had to go through. And then, on top of that, thinking of what Dan Rassier and his family had to go through. And I listened to audio of the search warrant. And the FBI or the police department, I'm not sure which one it was. And so I don't want to cast judgment upon the innocent parties, but whoever was doing that search warrant and was, yelling and taking the mom to jail because she wasn't cooperating, didn't want people to search. I get all that. I've been in that situation. Can you blame them? They were innocent. They had nothing to do with anything. And you are going in there to take this old man's gun away from him, his shotgun. Listen, I understand as a matter of safety of why you would do it. But now I hope that you can look back and say, man, Any government official coming to take guns from you, what's that remind you of? You never want to give up your guns, especially when you're innocent, right? Which the Rassier family surely was. So it troubled me, so I wanted to talk about it. We can learn from it. And that's all we can do. I will leave you with this. If there's any investigators or true crime amateurs that are watching, if you just have even the slightest bit of respect for the genre, or me, or the victims' families, please, I beg you, please, do not ever point your finger at a suspect. Gary Francis Post, Arthur Lee Allen, all these other people who's probably Dan Roussier, people's names that have been ruined when they had nothing to do with it. So unless you have direct physical evidence, don't ruin that person's life or that person's family's life, because that's exactly what you're doing for your 15 minutes of fame. And it's gross, it's horrible, it's despicable. Have integrity in your investigations. If you feel confident of your suspect, what's it matter if you use his real name or you make up a name? The evidence that you have, whether it's circumstantial or indirect, is still going to be there. By pointing your finger at him, what's that do for you? Nothing. But it does a lot for him because it ruins his life. So if that's done to anybody, hey, if you're watching this, do what Dan Rassier did. I'm not a big proponent of suing people. Okay? I had a true crime, I think she's, I don't know if you could classify her as a celebrity right now. She tried to sue me back in 2017 because I did the show on the History Channel on the Zodiac case. The History Channel reached out to me. I didn't go to them. It wasn't my deal. But this idiot decides to sue me because she says that was her case. And now she has this big true crime podcast and everything, and people listen to her. I just shake my head. Just like this female criminal profiler, who she says she's a profiler, sent me a message years ago saying cold cases are a waste of time. And I still keep that message because it inspires me to not be like her. But yet all these people listen to her and her nonsense. Anyhow, I'm not a big proponent of suing people. But if you are wrongly accused and your name is out there in the public and it's put out there by amateurs, by professionals, sue them. They deserve it. I'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching this edition of Unsolved No More. Hopefully this is a learning experience. Thoughts and prayers to Jacob Wetterling's family that have gone through this tragedy. And also the family of Dan Rassier, who did nothing wrong. And Danny Heinrich, you got what you deserved, and you deserve to be in jail longer than 25 years. And I hope you stay there the rest of your miserable life. Thanks for watching. Main's out.